Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Taylor and I'm here at the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. On behalf of the Canadian Centre here in Ottawa and the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, I'd like to welcome you to our session today. If this is your first time, you may know we have created this series to replace the cancelled in-person Environmental Evidence Summit that was supposed to be here in Ottawa in June. Unfortunately, we couldn't host that, but this webinar series has given us an opportunity to reach hundreds more people than we had originally planned, so we're happy to have you here now. I would like to welcome you to part 2 of our November session, which is mobilizing knowledge for evidence-based approaches in the Anthropocene. And now I will pass it over to our chairs, Sam and Steve.
All right, good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. Welcome to the second section of this month's webinar focused on mobilizing knowledge for evidence-based approaches in the Anthropocene. For those of you who joined us earlier this month, welcome back. And for those of you who are new to this session, we're glad you've taken the time to join us. We will be bringing different perspectives from across the research and decision-making space in environmental and development sectors on challenges and opportunities for mobilizing knowledge. We are your co-organizers, along with Vivian Nguyen from Carleton University, who could not join us today. My name is Stephen Alexander, Science Advisor based in the Environment and Biodiversity Science Branch at Fisheries and Oceans Canada.
Hi, and I'm Sam Chang. I'm a conservation scientist at the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History, and I'm the coordinator of the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence's US-based center here. So in today's session, we're going to give a brief overview of the topic space, followed by our 3 presenters, Steve Alexander, Peter Pulsifer, and Martin Westgate. Following these talks, we'll be hosting a panel discussion with our presenters and the moderators on their experiences and their opportunities they see from mobilizing knowledge aided by different types of technological approaches. So for the audience, we ask that you please send any questions for our speakers through the questions function in the sidebar, and we'll have the speakers address them after the talks. If you have any logistic or technical issues, please direct them to Jess Taylor in the chat window as part of GoToWebinar. Oops. So we've heard a lot in this webinar series about evidence synthesis and their utility for harnessing this growing body of knowledge to inform policy and practice across a range of different decisions and users. So in particular, the challenges we're facing in the Anthropocene are characterized by their inherent complexity. And there's a significant degree of both uncertainty and of risk in the scale and the scope of the challenges that are occurring across these very complex and interlinked social and natural systems, the decisions we're making within them, and the multiple actors that are involved.
Accordingly, understanding how to mobilize this for multiple actors is of paramount importance. In recent years, there's been a significant shift away from thinking about mobilizing knowledge using a loading dock model, where information, relevant or not, is simply released into the wild and may never actually be picked up and used. Last session, we heard from our 3 presenters about the challenges and opportunities and experiences in mobilizing knowledge for and from evidence synthesis for diverse actors, decision contexts, and knowledge types.
So in today's session, we're going to focus on how technological approaches and tools, so for example, things like data portals, summaries, and visualizations can help facilitate knowledge uptake along this pathway and build connections across evidence generators on the left and evidence synthesizers across this and evidence users. And while there's been exciting growth in the production of these types of approaches, we're still exploring how these tools can be effectively designed, how they can be effectively deployed to maximize their utility for decision-making in the Anthropocene. So before we begin, a quick reminder to our audience to please send any questions through the question function for our speakers. All right, so I'll start us off to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Stephen Alexander. So he's a science advisor at the Fisheries and Oceans Canada, where he provides guidance with regards to shifting towards models of knowledge co-production along with more collaborative modes of research. Steve, take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Sam. I would like to begin, before moving on, by acknowledging the Anishinaabe peoples on whose unceded traditional territory where I am a guest and joining you all from today in Ottawa, Ontario. Now, the arc of this first presentation, we'll be talking about the Bridging Indigenous and Science-Based Knowledge web portal, about mobilizing qualitative evidence. And for today's talk, there's going to be kind of 4 aspects. I'm going to start briefly with an introduction and background. Then I'm going to talk about the Bridging Indigenous and Science-Based Knowledge initiative and accompanying web portal. From there, I'm going to discuss briefly some challenges and opportunities, and I'm going to close out with a few next steps. Now, keeping that in mind, let's get a little background. Now, in the Canadian context, an increased focus on environmental research, monitoring, and management practices that are inclusive of Indigenous knowledge systems is driven by a number of interrelated factors, including federal legal requirements and international commitments to include Indigenous knowledge in environmental conservation, ethical considerations and responsibilities, and increased research capacity and self-determination among Indigenous communities, specifically those of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. However, successfully drawing upon multiple types of knowledge in environmental research and management remains a challenge. In response, there's been an emerging need for examples and strategies for bridging multiple ways of knowing. That is, questions arise of, well, what does it look like and where has it happened? And perhaps most important when we think about practice is how. How does this weaving and bridging take place? Now, when I talk about bridging knowledge systems, I'm referring to a process that maintains the integrity of each respective knowledge system while enabling the reciprocal exchange of understanding for mutual learning. Now, the great news is that we have a wealth of examples. There's been a proliferation of place-based case studies that bring together multiple ways of knowing, shedding light on diverse species, habitats, and ecosystems globally. Moreover, there is much that could be learned from these case studies with regards to the methods and approaches to inform practice. Yet the challenge is that these examples are scattered throughout the literature. Therefore, our research scientists and staff are left having to navigate this extensive labyrinth. So what can be done to help speed up the process of bringing to light and pulling together all of the most relevant examples to learn and inform practice around bridging different ways of knowing? This spawned the establishment of the Bridging Indigenous and Science-Based Knowledge Initiative at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. The overall goals and objectives are to identify practices, processes, and principles for bridging multiple ways of knowing in the context of research and monitoring. And so as a first step, we're seeking to identify cases where knowledge bridging has happened. And from there, we can ask a set of additional questions. So how has that knowledge bridging happened? What kind of methods and models and approaches have been used? What are the particular outcomes from these activities? And can we identify exemplary cases, those bright spots, and further understand the context-dependent practices and principles? Now, I'm going to talk today about where we're at, which is at this very first stage with regards to identifying cases where knowledge bridging has happened. How do we start to build up the number of examples that we can learn from? And to this end, we have conducted a series of systematic maps that are either completed, in process, or in process, I should say. We completed last year a systematic map focused on the coastal marine environments across Canada. We're now just wrapping up a systematic map on across Canada's freshwater ecosystems. And finally, we're partnering with collaborators over at Environment and Climate Change Canada to conduct a systematic map across the terrestrial landscape. And from the very first one, we identified 71 published case studies. So those of you who are involved in conducting systematic maps and reviews, when you pull together a set of case studies, one of the things you can do is you can produce a report, really satisfying to see the location of all of these case studies that we identified. And while there's much we can learn by looking in aggregate across these 71 case studies, there's a lot of rich information that is found behind each of these single points or these centroids that represent the case studies. And so it was reflecting further on this, right? What we did is we pulled together a number of relevant examples for our scientists and staff to be able to learn from. And we can learn and provide guidance based when we look across them, but there's so much that could be learned by looking at those individual ones. And this very static map just didn't seem like it would do the job of being able to bring to light the rich qualitative information and examples that come from each individual case study that's asking different research questions focused on particularly different species or working with different knowledge systems and different communities. And so it was reflecting further on wanting to identify ways to mobilize and bring to light and make accessible these individual case studies that are most relevant for the many different contexts in which our research scientists and staff work, that resulted in the establishment of the Bridging in Science-based knowledge web portal. It is a unique web-based knowledge mobilization tool to access the numerous published studies across Canada's aquatic ecosystems that weave multiple ways of knowing. And the idea is to amplify research, work that's already been done, to foster awareness, and to strengthen partnerships. Now, how did we go about doing this? Well, to go from concept to pilot platform, we started with kind of a SketchUp, a vision of what this could look like. And then we developed and worked through an iterative design process that included beta testing and requirement gathering sessions with targeted end user groups. This included our research scientists and staff based within the ecosystem and ocean sciences sector, also staff from other sectors and representatives from our regional offices. And in addition, representatives from Indigenous organizations who are supported through the ARM program, that's the Aboriginal Aquatic Resource and Oceans Management, contributed to the iterative design process as well. The other thing we did and kept in mind as we were going through this design process was aligning the work and the interface and the portal with a number of other initiatives, one being the Marine Spatial Data Infrastructure Initiative, which is a departmental specific initiative, and then the other was the Federal Geospatial Platform. The importance of this was to make sure we aligned and we're thinking about interoperability. This is something that Dr. Pulsiver works on quite a bit and can speak to how critical and important this is. Now, in thinking about this new web portal, one thing that's helpful to keep in mind is also recognizing the number of really important and critical Indigenous-led portals and platforms. Examples include SIKU, the Indigenous Knowledge Social Network, or ILOCA, the Exchange for Local Observations and Knowledge of the Arctic. These are Indigenous-led and informed and really play a critical role in serving as a platform for communities and nations to be able to document and share knowledge while retaining ownership, control, access, and possession. Thinking about data sovereignty, but it's really about the knowledge itself that they are looking to share. In our instance, what we're looking at is not to so much highlight the individual knowledge as much as it is to provide examples. These case studies that we've identified are examples of where different ways of knowing have been brought together. And that is what we're looking to highlight specifically and what we're pulling together. And so we've pulled out key information related to those different cases that we can then learn from and that our staff can learn from. So one way to think about this portal and interface is I noted that it aligned with the Federal Geospatial Platform. That allows us to bring in other relevant data sets to inform learning, foster awareness. So for instance, that can include information related to historic and modern treaties, traditional territories and jurisdictions, because context is so important and place is so important. As well, like we can bring in relevant ecological and biophysical data layers related to federal marine bioregions or protected areas. And then on top of this, we layer and bring in these curated metadata sets. So the first one was related to coastal marine. We're just finalizing the second data set of case studies focused on Canada's freshwater aquatic systems, and then we'll be moving to bring in the terrestrial case studies. Now, what does this look like and how does it operate? So it's geospatially oriented. And so we have these 71 case studies, and because they came through a systematic review, we then had a series of variables or key information related to each of those case studies that we could then use to be able to search and filter across those different cases. So this is showing an example where there was a search for all the results related to salmon. And so you see on the map itself, those polygons are kind of highlighted in a light purple and are scattered across the 3 coasts. You can hover over it and see some of the key information related to those individual case studies. And then you can also click to bring yourself to the full text. So the idea being is to provide an interface for our staff and scientists to be able to really learn and dive into relevant examples, whether they're interested in and work on particular species, a particular region, or they work with particular methods and they want to find other examples that say use remote sensing. What kind of questions have been asked? So this is something that we've been working on, developing, and are continuing to iterate and grow. So what have been some of the challenges and opportunities related to this particular web portal? Well, the first was really having to think about the importance of starting small and staying focused. It's very easy to try to want to do everything, but if you try to make your portal or platform do everything, then you might not do any one thing really well. So it's this fine balance of how do you gather insights from potential end users and think about, well, who's your core end user? And then who are other relevant end users that may also find use in it, and thinking about how you could then leverage from that core outwards. The other is be open. This is something because you're striking this balance to make sure you're staying focused and trying not to have mission creep, if you will, that you can serve everyone's needs. But by being open, then all of a sudden it starts to become clearer, or new opportunities present themselves, and you can see other ways and benefits of how this portal can be leveraged in really powerful ways. And I'll speak to that briefly on the next slide. And then lastly is the importance of prioritizing learning and evaluation so that you can continually inform and iterate the portal to ensure that you're continually meeting the needs of your targeted end users. So when I talk about being open, one of the things we talk about when we talk about this portal is there's 3 key benefits. The first is amplifying research. So sharing and making accessible examples of previous research to learn from and build upon. We're looking for concrete examples of where different ways of knowing were brought to bear and that we could learn from to inform practice. The second was to foster awareness of diverse cultures, ways of knowing, and research methods. And finally, the third was to strengthen partnerships. That is to build upon current relationships and establish new relationships with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities. And in this regard, as we started having further clarity, we realized we could move from just amplifying research and making accessible these particular case studies to learn from, but that we could also use this as a tool to foster awareness and to strengthen partnerships. And then as we do that, we start to think about what other kinds of information would we want to bring in that helps keep it evergreen and that maximizes and kind of really supports these multiple objectives that we could serve. So where to? What are our next steps? Well, we're working on expanding the collection of case studies to be able to learn from. Another important step is some additional evaluation and critical appraisal. Right now, we have examples of where different ways of knowing have been brought together. I should say multiple ways of knowing, but we have made no assumptions or have not made any assessments to say these are the ones that do it really well, and therefore we should learn from these ones, and these ones there's more that could have been done. Perhaps they're not the best examples. So trying to find really relevant ways and that are contextually appropriate to think about how we conduct that critical appraisal and help further support the filtering and amplifying, to make sure we're amplifying good practices, best practices. The other is exploring other relevant layers in support of the overall objectives, as I highlighted on that previous slide. And finally, looking ahead to think about evaluation of the web portal to understand use and its impact. Are we achieving those objectives that we set out to achieve? So with that, I say thank you, merci beaucoup, and miigwech.
Thanks so much, Steve. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Peter Pulsifer. Dr. Pulsifer's research centers on geomatics and cartography with a particular focus on supporting interoperability, the ability of geographic information systems to readily share information and operations. Since 2006, his work has been focused on working with and addressing priority issues of Inuit and other indigenous peoples of the Arctic, for example, Gwich'in, Yupik, and Sami peoples. All right, turning it over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Steve, for that great presentation. I too would like to recognize that Ottawa, where I reside, is located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. And thank you for your time today. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of my experience developing systems, particularly knowledge mobilization systems in the Arctic region of Canada and elsewhere in the world. So before going on to talking about the systems, I just wanted to say a few words about the Arctic as a region. Some of you may be familiar with the Arctic, but many people are not. And I think it's easy to just think about it as this distant place that there's not much there, there's not much interesting. But it's actually really complex and has a lot of complexity. Not only in terms of wildlife, et cetera, but across many different themes. So I won't go into all of the details of this graphic in the interest of time, but if you look just at the bottom, you'll see what's called the collaborative dimension. So when we're thinking about Arctic research, we have everything from very isolated studies that have maybe one researcher to very large collaborative initiatives, such as the International Polar Year that happened about a dozen years ago. On the conceptual side, we have some people looking at one specific single topic, others looking at whole systems, ecological systems, socioeconomic systems, and so on. And then from a spatial temporal dimension, vertically, we also have everything from the very local in very small places, villages, regions, etc., right up through to the international. And we're thinking about things that have happened sometimes millions of years in the past to sometimes at least hundreds or thousands of years into the future. So what this results in is a very large system of initiatives, of people, of organizations, some of whom are down in the lower area where it says PRJ3, and they're that maybe lone grad student who's looking at a single question in one community or one area, right up through to the international projects that are looking at many different topics. And our challenge going forward is thinking about how do we exchange and get a flow of information, data, knowledge, and so on in this highly complex system. So one of the exciting parts of working in the Arctic is that we have the great opportunity to build on and share the knowledge of Indigenous peoples that has existed for millennia. And this is a really active and growing space, as Steve's presentation showed. There are a lot of different things happening, a lot of new systems being developed, often digital systems, sometimes not. But we do have some challenges. So stable resources, of course, are a challenge. We see a lot of project-based initiatives, but not necessarily program-based or sort of A-based, as some people might call it, with the long-term funding and personnel. We also have challenges related to bridging the worldviews, and this came up in Steve's talk and will come up again in our discussions, is how do we think about particularly linking the concepts and semantics represented in these information systems. And then another big part is just Indigenous peoples must lead their engagement and work with their knowledge. So governance is important, and that's under active development right now, particularly in Canada, but elsewhere in the world. And so all of these things play into thinking about systems development. In terms of my own work, at present, I am the Associate Director of the Geomatics and Cartographic Research Center, or GCRC, at Carleton University, where I've been affiliated there for many years, but had just taken over as Associate Director. So we've done a lot of work with Indigenous communities over about 20 years now. I am also the principal investigator of ALOCA, the Exchange for Local Observations and Knowledge of the Arctic, which has been in existence since 2006. Although that's a part-time effort for me now, Noor Johnson has now taken over as the day-to-day lead of that project with my recent move. If you look at those two projects, we're close to 50 different systems that have been developed under those projects. And many of them, not all, but many are focused on making Indigenous knowledge more available through digital platforms. So I'm not going to talk about all of those. I don't have the time for that, but one in particular I think is really interesting is a community-led and owned initiative, the Clyde River Knowledge Atlas. So it's the community itself through a research center called ITAC, which is located in Clyde River on the northeast coast of Baffin Island in Canada, who have developed this atlas with assistance of some partners. And it has many different stories. You'll see the tab is Our Stories, and it tells many stories. And this is a fundamental one, which is the story of Clyde River place names. I don't have the live version up, but if you go to the live version, you will actually hear the place names. So this starts to bring in the dimension of understanding the appropriate types of representation. So not only thinking about the textual base or the database, but actually hearing, speaking the names. And so this becomes very clear when you're working on these projects that you really need to be aware of what appropriate representations are and what's going to fit, not only with the knowledge, but the people who are primary users, as well as the secondary and other users. At the same time, in the same atlas, the community owns a network of weather stations that they've been operating for more than a decade now. And so they use visualization and other types of techniques to make that data available. So very different, not looking here at heritage or language preservation, but very much part of the day-to-day activities of the community. And this is shared within the community and beyond for the benefit of all. It can get complicated though. I think some people come into these processes and think I'm going to create a representation system, an atlas, a web GIS, whatever the case may be, and they think, let's do the bridging that Steve touched on, and it can't be all that difficult, and think of it as simply a translation process. So some of this work is being done using very technical systems called the semantic web set of technologies that tries to capture and constrain meaning, particularly machine-to-machine learning. And many years ago, I was involved in a project out of University of Colorado and based in Alaska, where we were looking at Inupiaq knowledge of sea ice, as well as operational knowledge of sea ice, particularly the World Meteorological Organization. So in the simple model, you can say Suguliaq, young ice, gray or gray, white in color, is equivalent to or same as the WMO definition. Apologies, there we go. And so if you have a computer do the reasoning, this is what you would end up with, is this is equivalent, so therefore this is the definition that we can use. However, the actual creators and users of the Inupiaq knowledge do not include the 10 to 30 centimeters in thickness as part of the definition, because they're looking at it in terms of usability and actually how the ice supports their activities. So it's incorrect and potentially damaging to simply equate these. So you really have to think about the nuances, and this takes time, it takes energy, it takes collaboration. And it takes a recognition that in some cases, in many cases, there will be some loss or decontextualization through this translation process. So you have to be thinking about the understanding and the extensive requirements for doing this type of work. Just some key messages, and then I'll go into my last few slides. So representations, particularly visualizations and that type of things, they must be carefully considered and co-produced. So having all of the right people around the table, not strictly the technicians or the system designers. Ethical and appropriate reduction, abstraction, or automation, it can't always be achieved. We can't just assume that if we try hard enough, we're going to be able to get there. So we have to be able to accept that not all of the systems that we have been using are going to be appropriate for the next project, and be willing to do what needs to be done to get where we need to go. And then context and nuance matter, as I've shown in a couple of previous slides. So going forward to thinking about this with respect to the larger polar information ecosystem, so not just thinking about indigenous knowledge, it's an area that I've done quite a bit of work in over the last 7 years, in particular as chair of the International Arctic Data Committee. We have a lot of progress that's been made since the International Polar Year that I mentioned in 2007 to 2009. We now have a framework for cooperation, and we recognize it's a socio-technical system. So it's not just the data and the systems and technologies, but it's a lot of people and organizations involved. So what we've found is to try and move forward as a community and understand how to do planning, how to mobilize knowledge, how to think about synthesis, how to think about evidence construction, particularly in relation to these difficult questions that we're trying to answer about the impact of the polar region and the Arctic in particular on the global system. We found it was a lot more complex than we first thought. So this initial project that I'm referring to here called Mapping the Arctic Data Ecosystem, which is now mapping the polar data ecosystem, we revealed hundreds of different organizations, databases, data organizations, data centers, and so on, that we need to consider when we're trying to understand, where the information, the data, the knowledge resides and how it's being shared, et cetera. So this has been done with a live database using what's called the triple store. I'm not going to go into those details. I can touch on it maybe in questions. But what it allows us to do is to start to analyze these relationships and understand not only what they are, but what they could be. And start thinking about it in ecological terms. What are those keystone species that are really central to the survival and thriving of the system? And then thinking also not just again about the technology, but the people involved. So just wrapping up, some of the key messages there is that organizations have traditionally, I would argue, in the Arctic used a rational classical strategy to understand and plan. It's sort of, let's analyze the problem, set a strategy, and take a linear approach and moving forward and do it in 5-year increments, 10-year increments, et cetera. But if you look into the research in new types of systems, and particularly in information and communication technologies like ICT, the internet itself, there's a lot more going on there, and those traditional systems don't stand up. Things are much more dynamic, and so we need new ways of thinking, new theories, et cetera, including information ecology, another that my colleague Sandy Starkweather uses called polycentric governance. And so ecological thinking can really help us, I think, in this regard, because it understands all of these interconnections and the implications of the individual nodes and so on. So with that, I will say thank you and look forward to taking any questions during the session.
Thanks so much, Peter. That was a really interesting presentation. I want to remind all of our audience members to please put any questions you might have into the questions box. And we'll move on now to our third and final speaker, Dr. Martin Westgate. So Dr. Westgate is a science advisor to the Atlas of Living Australia. He is a visiting fellow at the Australian National University in Canberra, and he is the co-founder of the Evidence Syntheses Hackathon series. All right, Martin, take it away.
Thanks, Sam. That's great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for logging on. Good to see you, or not in this case. And welcome to sunny Canberra. It's early in the morning here. I'd like the other speakers, acknowledge that you're now on Ngunnawal country and pay my respects to their elders, and past, present, and emerging. So what I'm here to talk to you about today, so I work for the Atlas of Living Australia, which is based out of CSIRO, but I'm here to talk about a different atlas today, which is an entirely unrelated thing, which is a project called Every Atlas, and comes out of some work that I did with the Evidence Syntheses Hackathon series, which I developed with my co-author here, Neil Hadaway. And when I say I did this work, I'd like to point out that actually I kind of didn't. This is a collective project, and as you'll see, it's a younger project than the other ones you've been hearing about so far this morning, and it's very much a collaborative one. in which I didn't do most of the code. So it's nice to be able to talk about and boost the work of other people while still acknowledging that they did the work and not me. But the motivation for this project. So I'm going to go through where this project came from. I'm going to give you an example of how it works. I'm going to try and flag where we're hoping to go with it. This is an early stage project, though it is functional, so I hope you find something useful here. And basically, the Evidence Synthesis Hackathon was a series that's still going. We're running our next conference in January, but previously it was for in-person events. Now, clearly that doesn't work too well in the COVID era, but back in 2018, this was all very easy to do, and so our first event was held in Stockholm. And I put up a shot from a brainstorming session. So basically, this was an attempt to bring together people who worked in evidence synthesis in a quite broad sense. So there were a lot of academics, but there were a lot of people who did programming. There were a few who worked for NGOs. There were some who were in industry as well. And bring them together and see what their interests and experience and knowledge gaps were, and see if they could work together on, in some cases, pieces of software, but other cases, strategies or ideas or concepts that would help move the field forward. So very much in the vein of a classic academic workshop, but with an emphasis on getting some things done. And during that session, a team of people who all had programming skills in R, the statistical programming language, decided that there was a gap in the market for, or rather, let me rephrase that. So the sort of portals that you've been seeing this morning are a really useful way of summarizing scientific information. For a broad range of audiences, it's very easy to log onto a website and see a portal, but a portal itself is difficult to develop unless you have a lot of resources and a lot of time. Taking information that you might get from a standard academic project, say a systematic review or a systematic map, where you have a database of studies and their attributes, and converting that into a portal is actually a really challenging thing to do, just technically. Static websites are somewhat easier, but an interactive web page is a challenge. And so this team decided that we could build that, and so we used the technology called Shiny, which is a package in R for building interactive websites, and basically ran an experiment to see what they could do. And so that led to a piece of software. There's a paper here that was published in Environmental Evidence, which came out last year. Neil Hadaway was the lead author on that, but the programming team were really the drivers of it. So Andrew, Matt, Charles, Ezgi, and Sunita really led the work on this. And so I'm just going to give you a quick talk to what that actually does. I haven't brought up the interactive version here just in case tech problems got in the way, but I'd encourage you, there's a live version that's linked down here, or you can visit our GitHub page for the Evidence Synthesis Hackathon and run it locally on your machine. So that's for those who have a knowledge of R, that should be fairly straightforward. But basically, it just brings up a page and it's got some information in these tabs across the top, which tells you about what every atlas is, how it works, but the purpose of it is to enable the user to interactively draw plots using their data, and obviously a map of studies, something that Stephen was showing, and is a common use case for this sort of a database. So you might want to choose where your latitude and longitude data is and simply plot it. You might want to export that yourself. You might want to put it on a different base map. So this website enables you to do that. I should point out there's a way for users in the web version to upload their own data, so they don't just have to use case study examples. And as you use these tabs on the left, you can do various other things, draw heat maps, draw histograms, whatever you want to do. So in a sense, that's that was literally done in 3 days in Stockholm in 2018, and it's had a lot of work since then. It's more stable. It's a bit prettier than it used to be, and it's live, which is beneficial as well. So anyone can go away and use this. They can put their own data in. They can give some maps and things. So that's all very well, but the problem with that is that it doesn't enable you to create your own version of every atlas that only stores your data and display that as your own unique portal. And the reason we thought that was useful is because there are a lot of these projects happening. A systematic review is a very common type of publication now. And so it's possible there's a lot of researchers, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of academics who are very interested in sharing their own data and don't really want to see our default shell. And so what we've done is created what's called an R package. So previously we had an app, a website that you could go to. And now we have what's called an R package. So you can download it within R and you can run a simple function. And this is simply the README from our GitHub page. So you can go to this page that's listed here. And that'll give you instructions for how to install and use it. But simply it's a case of just loading this package. And what it does is in a simple function, you can say the app name, you can specify your own data, and that generates all the files that you need in the correct structure to have your own version of EviAtlas that natively stores your own data. And you can run that using these simple lines of code. That's simply all you need to do to get this to work. Now, that's useful. It allows you to build your own app. You could then test it on your own machine. You could push it to something like Shiny Apps, which is a website that hosts these things for you, that provides you with a server. You could do it on your own if you have those sort of technical knowledge. What that's useful for is not so much just giving you the same thing that we've got, but with new data in it, but as a boilerplate piece of code so that you could edit it however you wanted. That said, that's still a bit of a technical barrier. And so there's a question of exactly to what extent we support users to customize within the package that we're developing. So that could be something simple like specifying extra arguments about how you want the app to look, providing a logo, that sort of thing. Or it could be something more sophisticated. We could, the technology for developing Shiny apps has come a long way in 2 years, and it is now not impossible to have modular elements of Shiny apps and have them build together in a sensible way, in a way that was challenging a couple of years ago. And so what I'd like to see and what I'm working on with, in collaboration with the team that led this is some way of doing that. So the other point is that once this becomes an R package, it can fit into an R package ecosystem, and I'm keen to see this become part of what we call the Metaverse project, which is a collaborative project for linking together R packages that have shared functionality. So I've put a series of these up on the screen here. So if you wanted to run a systematic review or a systematic map process, the idea is you could load Metaverse and that would give you a series of packages that do useful things. So Syntheses is new this year, developed between me and Eliza Grames at the University of Connecticut. So that's simply for importing bibliographic data in as clean a way as we could find to do. Let's Searcher is Eliza's package for search term optimization. RevTools is a screening package that I developed, and there's a series of packages, things like data extraction through meta-digitize, meta-analysis through metaphor, visualization through risk of bias. And I could imagine that once you got to the end of that process and had a published output, EviAtlas would be a sensible last place to use to collate that data, put it online so that it can be shared and reused. So I'd like to see EviAtlas become part of that software ecosystem. Of course, it needs to be finalized by itself first. So I'm going to leave it there. That was quite a brief overview of the work we've been doing there, but I think there's a lot of space here for while the state of the art really is the talks you've seen earlier on today, with people thinking very carefully and very closely about how best to represent specific pieces of information. I think there's also a space for general purpose way of sharing information more easily and more readily for non-expert users, and that's the sort of gap that we're hoping to fill with EviAtlas, and it's what we'll be working on over the next months and years. I would like to reiterate that I did not develop this whole product by myself, or even partly by myself. I'm leading the effort to turn this into a package, but I didn't write the source code. So the team at the bottom here are the people that we should actually be thanking for that. So thank you for your time.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Martin. And thank you, everyone, for all these really interesting and really thought-provoking presentations. I certainly now am like, we don't have to have a discussion. I just want to go dig into all these portals, but we will. So I'd like to invite our speakers to come back on and turn on their cameras, and I will as well. And we're going to have a bit of a panel discussion about some of the themes that you all have brought up in your talks. And I think it would be great to really get some of the perspectives on some of the risks and challenges that you all have run into, and some words of advice to our audience. So one of the things that I want to start us off with is, when we introduced this series of webinars, we talked a lot about this sort of gap that's between the production of evidence and the use of evidence, and the ways in which we can bridge it. And part and parcel to that is having data sets, having portals, having approaches that maximize interoperability. And that this interoperability is really needed for us to deal with the complexity for both the utility and the integration of databases and portals across these different decision spaces and knowledge types. And so I'd like to start off by getting your perspectives on where you think there might be risks and opportunities, both for trying to maximize interoperability, but also being able to layer and compare all these different data sets. So Martin, I want to start with you. You brought up a lot of the technical challenges that evidence synthesizers are encountering when they're trying to bring together different data sets and move and translate and communicate them in different ways. Oh, sorry. So could you speak a bit about your experience and the types of decisions that your team had to make when developing EviAtlas, when you're working with you potentially have a very diverse set of end users, and the types of sort of development decisions you had to make in that sense?
Yeah, sure, happy to talk about that. I mean, I would point out that I wasn't in the room for the whole of the development of this, so some of the decisions got made entirely in my absence, and that's totally fine. Since then, I mean, EviAtlas is unusual in that it's in that it tries to be general purpose, but of course the definition of general purpose depends on who's in the room, and you get a bunch of computer scientists together and they interpret general purpose as being some different diagrams, right? And as we've seen from the other speakers, that's not everyone's perspective, and that's not even always the perspective that everyone needs, or that the user base needs, perhaps. And I see this a lot in my work. What someone wants to develop isn't necessarily what someone wants to see. And there is a tension there, or a challenge that can only really be overcome by, in a trivial sense, by people literally sending you feedback and telling you you're great at things or rubbish at things, or perhaps in a slightly more sophisticated way of some sort of detailed stakeholder engagement discussion, that sort of thing. So the decisions we made were very much about what, and bearing in mind this was done in a hackathon initially, so this was done fast. I think it's come out to be something useful, which is in some sense a surprise, but a welcome one, and a lot of that is the follow-up that the team did. So I've only mentioned this as being developed at one event, but that's not the case. The team met up again separately for a second event to redevelop it, and it's been Andrew Fireman in particular has put a couple of years of work into this since then. So I think it's kind of a nice little coincidence that's come together that well. But I do think if you were to, it would be very difficult to build a general purpose piece of software that would do sophisticated things like providing information on people's different sets of meaning for different places is a very complicated thing, and some of the stuff that Peter was talking about I think was fantastic, but would be very difficult to anticipate, you know what I mean? It's quite specific to someone's particular use case. And so I think there's a bit of a tension is the wrong word. I think there's space in the market for a range of different ways of doing things. Well, I'd hope so, at least.
Thanks, Martin. And that, I think that definitely echoes with some of the messages that we were hearing from both Steve and from Peter. Steve, I'd like to turn this over to you and thinking about these case studies that you're collating across this entire Canadian landscape. Obviously there are many different things that folks are measuring. And so what was the process like for building sort of an intuitive framework for the web portal so that all the myriads of users with the different decisions and interests may be able to find some utility and sort of common user journey within that?
Great question, Sam. Thanks. That for us, one of the things, our starting point was having having conducted the systematic map, our very first one, as a starting point, that then gave us a starting point in terms of, well, what kind of information could we imagine that individuals could use to search and filter, and then did a bit of a thought experiment before even going out to the end users to try to imagine the different ways they might be interested in entering, right? It's about like, how do you enter, how do you dive in? If this is a domain, an area in which you are very unfamiliar and you're looking to learn, to find examples that can help inform your own practice. And from that standpoint, it was this thought experiment of, perhaps their entry point is through the species that they study, or the geographic region that they work, or the particular methods. And those weren't just random, they came from conversations. When you have people, say, I work with remote sensing, like, what does that look like? How can you bring remote sensing and multiple ways of knowing together? I do very heavy quantitative modeling. So is this, process of doing this kind of thought experiment, and then really being deliberate in the iterative design process as a way to try to work with the different potential end users to think through how are they going to interact with it early on, and then try to iterate. But what was hard is you have to make decisions at the end of the day, because you could get a huge diversity, because somebody sees it and says like, oh, I would love to use it to do this, this, and this. And that was kind of going back to that key learning was about like having a pretty clear parameter and focus in terms of what your core objective is, or your core user. And so how do you make sure whatever is being developed and co-developed through the design process is serving that initial objective, and then kind of building up from there? Because otherwise you end up being this like, the kitchen sink, everything in the kitchen sink, but nothing really works well. You do everything, but nothing quite well. So how do you start targeted and then build from a foundation, and then start seeing, oh, how can we build onto this in kind of incremental ways that become really powerful? And then, the result is something that's much stronger. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. I think it's quite difficult when, there's so many different things that technology can help us do. It's very tempting to make something that does everything. It's like the boombox that played CDs and tapes and MP3s, and invariably it broke. So Peter, this brings me to something that you were talking about, and in particular, having the perspective, having worked across all these different types of portals and efforts to cross-link knowledge and share knowledge across the entire polar landscape. How do you think projects have grappled with this need to be inclusive and reflective of all the different knowledge types, but then also the challenges of having some data perhaps that isn't readily translatable to something like a digital platform?
That's a really good question. I think in some cases, they haven't really rose to the challenge. It's been challenging to think about the different user bases, et cetera, but I think of it in terms of the mediation layers. And so we have often all of these data resources, information resources, et cetera. And now what we're seeing is a lot of tools that are being put on top of that, not just tools, but also types of thinking in how to do the types of things that both our other speakers have talked about. Like, how do you take it from that raw space into something that's going to be appropriate for these different end users? And so this is where, with the semantic mediation that I was talking about across languages, that sits on top of these raw data stores. So if you have vocabularies coming from indigenous communities or place names, et cetera, you can make them available just as is, but that lends itself maybe to misuse or at least misunderstanding. But if you can create tools on top of that that can sort of add the type of thing Steve was talking about into that, you can have a mediated product that may be more appropriate. And so that's what we've really done. And while we're doing that, we really have to think about all the risk possibilities. In some cases, it's great to release the place names because they're beside the USGS or Canadian government place names. In other cases, people worry about, is it going to reveal a sacred site that might be abused? So that's that middle layer that I think is critical in our new sort of world of products.
Yeah, and I think that the importance of how data is used, what kind of safeguards we can put into place as, sort of sitting in the middle here and developing these portals to ensure that, the end data isn't misused, but that it's also fully utilizable by all the potential end users that are out there. And so we have about 5 minutes left. So I kind of want to wrap our last set of perspectives sort of into one here. I'd like to get a closing thought from all of you on a word of advice or a key lesson that you've learned that you'd like to impart for those who are looking to engage in data portals and sort of data sharing, knowledge sharing in this digital format in some way, whether it's building their own portal or it's figuring out where portals can be leveraged in the work that they're doing, whether for research or for decision, with also a thought of thinking about how issues of equity and power might emerge. I think you've all brought up sort of key considerations, both in who has a voice in creating a portal and what kind of data goes into it, and then also whose power and sort of inclusion can be improved through the creation of these portals in the decision-making process. So why don't we go in the opposite order that we just did? So Peter, we'll kick it back to you.
Great. I think I'll probably say that just be brave. Don't succumb to the pressure to be everything to everybody. Don't let your funders or somebody else who's trying to say, yeah, you need to have 50 million followers or users. Figure out what it is you really want to do. What's your core objective and the core objective of your users, and follow that, and the rest will come from it.
Steve?
Yeah, that just one closing thought. Just you packed it. You really packed it in there. Closing thoughts and thinking about those embarking is really, I think, to add to what Peter had noted, was bring a humbleness to it, an openness, recognizing that you want it to stay. It needs to be evergreen. You need to think about kind of its evolving application and use, and you can't think of it in isolation. If you build it, they will come. But really thinking about how do you bring users not just into the design process, but to then making sure they're accessing it and using it, and kind of building in that iterative process, not just through the design, but then through the continued maintenance and ongoing development of it, to make sure it's continuing to serve the purpose that it set out to serve.
And Martin?
Yeah, look, I think that the point that Peter raised about the risks of oversharing data, that particularly data that doesn't necessarily belong to you in a cultural sense, is very real, and you see this in conservation as well with threatened species data, and so I think that's a very important point. But I think the broader message is, if that can be managed carefully and sensitively and correctly, the benefits are quite large to these sorts of things, in the sense that you are really supercharging an open science sort of a model by making this stuff not just accessible but visible and interactive, and I think that's only growing. It's becoming easier, and I think it's becoming more important, and so I think people should be brave. I'd like to reiterate that. I think it's a really good model to get this stuff out if people can do it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you to all of you for being on this panel and for your presentations. I think we've learned a lot from your perspectives, and our main takeaway to go forth and be brave, I think, is an important one for our time. I'm going to turn this back to Jess now, but I'd like everyone to give a round of digital applause for you all. Jess, back to you.
All right, thanks, Sam. Yeah, on behalf of CEE and the Canadian Centre here in Canada, I just want to thank Sam and Steve for chairing this session, and to Steve and Martin and Peter for their excellent presentations, and invite you all to join us for the December webinar. So that will be on December 8th. It's called Plotting a Course for Strengthening the Conservation Evidence Base, Integrating Multi-Actor Perspectives, and registration is open for that now. So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.